So good afternoon or good evening. Good evening to you. My name is Maja Kominko, and it's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of our project, Architectural Heritage Preservation in Times of War, the Ukrainian Model. This initiative, jointly implemented by the Kharkiv School of Architecture, Skeiron, and the Heritage Management Organization, focuses on training a new generation of conservation professionals in Ukraine. In practical terms, we do so by delivering a documentation and conservation course for the third-year students of Kharkiv School of Architecture and a course for academic teachers from architectural schools across Ukraine who plan to develop conservation courses at the institutions. Importantly, all documentation produced during this training will be usable in future conservation efforts. As part of this project, we are hosting a series of webinars with leading experts in the field. And today, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce a truly exceptional speaker, one of the world's foremost experts in heritage preservation, Professor Francesco Bandarin. Professor Bandarin is an architect and a planner specialized in urban conservation. From 2000 to 2010, he was director of the UNESCO World Heritage Center, and from 2010 to 2018, Assistant Director General of UNESCO for Culture. He is a member of the advisory committee of the Smithsonian Center for Folklife and Cultural Heritage and founding member of our World Heritage Initiative. He teaches at Sciences Po in Paris and advises governments and heritage conservation projects internationally. And this is by no means giving justice to his wonderful biography and his achievements. Today, Professor Bandarin will speak about his new book, a real tour de force publication, Changing Heritage, How Internal Tensions and External Pressures are Threatening Our Cultural and Natural Legacy. He will speak to us for about 60 minutes, and after that, there will be an opportunity for questions and discussions. So I'll come back to you then. And for now, I'm delighted to hand over to Francesco. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Maya, and dear colleagues. Thank you for inviting me to this very, very interesting initiative and the course that you're running. I am very humbled by this invitation. Being a retired person, normally we are sort of kept out of the things. But I think that you have a good memory. I remember when we met several times, had the opportunity to work together in the past. So thank you again for bringing me to your world. What I would like to do today is somehow bring you into a field of research that has taken kind of a long time for me, especially after my retirement. I decided to try to take a step back and look at my heritage field, the one where I was working for all my life, from a little bit of distance, and to try to identify the issues that I see are coming to the forefront from many, many directions. Heritage was created, was invented, and was shaped with this very clear intention of somehow preserving our legacy for the future generation. So it was a kind of a positive, humanistic idea linked to education, linked to an aspiration to somehow learn from the past and transmit these ideas to the future generation. Something very, you might even call it utopian, but certainly a humanistic drive. In modernity, the heritage has changed its meaning, and I was very struck by looking at the history. I will show you, we'll talk a little bit about history. How many times heritage has changed functions in society? How many, even dramatically, this has been somehow transformed by social processes, economic processes, and so on. So in spite of the idea that we have heritage as a kind of a stable process, I realized that, in fact, heritage is not stable at all. It's something that changes continuously. And the modern pressures that we have today, especially in the, since globalization has taken command of the world, have accelerated this process of a change. Now, this is a problem because, all the tools that have been shaped throughout the past, let's say, the past century or so, something like that, for preserving heritage, for identifying it, for proposing it to the public, for preserving, are somehow found themselves, insufficient to withstand the pressures and the changes that globalization has brought to the forefront. I think this contradiction, maybe these tensions, are very important. If we need to understand them. We need to somehow focus on them, understand them, and try to see how policy mechanisms can address them, and how we ourselves, as specialists, can address them. And the other thing that I noticed in doing this research is that very often we take these issues separately. There is an issue here that is related to, I don't know, tourism, or another issue there that is related to human rights, and then another one that is related to the very nature of our tools. And we think that these are separate problems. They are not. In fact, they form a constellation of issues that altogether are inducing very major changes in the role heritage plays in society. That was the core of my research, and I think it will be interesting to somehow exchange with you, see how this is reflected in your own experience and how we can somehow, make use of this thinking and this reflection to somehow move forward. Now, I will show you a little bit of a few slides just to let me see if I can make it better. I lost my. Let me just get it back. Sorry for this. Here it is. Okay. Now, all right. I hope you see the slides. Do you see the slides? Okay. So the first thing I would like to talk about, this is the cover of the book. I mean, and it's something for you to remember. But this is not necessarily the focus. I mean, the book is just an opportunity to talk about issues. The first thing that we need to focus on is something that sometimes, very strangely, by the way, is forgotten in our field. The field has a long history. I would say about 200 years, even a little more. But we forget that. We think it's something modern, recent. No, it's not at all. So if we want to understand how heritage has changed, what are its internal contradictions sometimes, we have to look at history. And really, I push you to look at this history very carefully, because it will help understand you how things have evolved through times. It's not easy because, believe me, in my own exploration, I found that history has been a bit forgotten by the conservators. There are very few reference texts on the history of heritage, and the history of this concept and how this, went through the changes of society. Very strange, for something that looks essentially uses the past as a field of operation, study, research, and even projection. It's very funny that we don't find very good literature that deals with the thing. And of course, when we look at history, we have also to look at history before even modernity, because we're not inventing anything. Of course, I'm not going to go much in detail, but if you look at the book or other texts, you will find that in fact, even in antiquity, this was something that really permeated the social life. We're not inventing anything, but what we have invented for sure is the fact that history, that heritage is not just an expression of power, is not just an expression of an elite, but something that now belongs to the entire society. This change happened in a very specific moment, which is the French Revolution, when the feudal order of Europe collapsed, and a new social class took power, and they somehow appropriated all the elements that the aristocracy and the monarchy had produced in the past several centuries. And the first time, the first period of the French Revolution, there was a moment of destruction. You see this very nice engraving that shows how the revolutionary armies are invading the Basilica of Saint-Denis in Paris, which, by the way, can still be visited, and destroyed all the royal tombs. They took literally, you see, the skeleton of the kings and then threw them away in a garbage, you know, to essentially as an act of revenge and also of destruction of the ancient regime. So this moment of collapse of social order was also a moment in which a new idea came about. And the new idea is that, in fact, all these things that have inherited from the past now belong to a collectivity, to the new order. And so the French were the first one that somehow made a change from the concept of heritage to something, you know, for the elite, for the educated elite, to something that, on the contrary, belongs to the entire collectivity, to the people, let's say to the people, but essentially to the collective, as a collective good. So all throughout the 19th century, we had this very, very interesting transition, you know, that somehow brought heritage to become a very important field of public policy. Because it was not only seen as an asset, like a kind of a capital good for the state, for the new states, but also a very important element to create and strengthen national identity. So at some point, heritage and national identity came together, and the 19th century is full of examples of this type. It became an international object of international policies only after World War I. This picture is very, very clear. This is the International Committee for Intellectual Cooperation, the first, let's say, prototype of what was then to become UNESCO. Created by the League of Nations, which was the prototype of the United Nations after World War I. Because after World War I, the nations understood that there was a need of creating a common culture and to somehow diffuse education and cultural understanding, a bit like what also was done after World War II, but maybe with more limited means. So at that time, they took the most enlightened people of the intellectuals. You can see them here in a meeting. You can see also Einstein on the fourth from left. So in order to promote important exchange processes and programs, which was were in fact worked for about 20 years until World War II, where somehow the initial infrastructure of what the international cooperation for cultural became after World War II. So, this trajectory from the French Revolution to the international committee, to the League of Nations is interesting to study because in a way it moves the concept of heritage from a national idea to an international idea. UNESCO was created, as you know, after World War II with similar purposes, but this time with much more emphasis and energy and resources. Although this picture you see is very interesting. It's the first meeting of UNESCO in London in 1945 when it was first created. And UNESCO was transferred to Paris the year after. And you see this is the first meeting of the delegates. You may notice a certain problem of gender balance there, but also a very funny, way of signaling, the member states and so on. So each one with a pole and so on. So it was very, very primitive, very initial. Okay, but in 1945, UNESCO was created, and that was the beginning of a modern idea of heritage. Heritage as an international collective good, something that international community had to deal with collectively, not only as individual nations. UNESCO was the interpreter of this new approach, and it came about in a very clear way in the 1950s when UNESCO launched a series of very major safeguarding campaigns, heritage safeguarding campaigns, starting with the one in Nubia. Now, Nubia is a valley that you see here on the southern, the bottom part of this chart, which where there was a serious problem because the big temples of Ramses and many other actually archaeological areas were located in this area. But with the Russian Soviet Union actually cooperation at that time, the Egypt decided to build this Aswan dam, huge dam. You see, one of the largest in the world, and in order to regulate the waters of the Nile and also to produce electricity and so on. So it was a major development project. But the consequence of this development project was the entire valley of Nubia, which is 500 kilometers, was flooded. So all the important monuments of the Nubia were doomed to be flooded. So an international, very big international campaign led by René Maheu, which is was the Director General of UNESCO, was launched. And it turned out, the basic idea was to lift up, these temples about 60, 70 meters in order to allow them to be rebuilt and reconstructed, recomposed at a higher level. This is not a simple engineering task, so it took a lot of resources, cooperation of international enterprise, of course, resources from many states. So this was a prototype of international cooperation for the protection of heritage, and of course the temple was then dismantled, as you can see, and you rebuilt on the top of a hill. So now you can see it. You can actually visit it. It's one of the highlights of the visits of southern Egypt today. But it was essentially the symbol of the new UNESCO role as a for international cooperation for heritage preservation. About this is the inauguration of in 1968 of the UNESCO decided this was one of the major missions. So in the period between 1955 or something like that until the mid 90s, so about 40 years. They launched about 30 campaigns of this sort. Some of them very, very important, like the one, for instance, for the reconstruction of the temple of Borobudur in Indonesia. It was very much dilapidated and destroyed before the reconstruction. Now it's completely redone. The protection of Mohenjo-Daro, very important archaeological site, one of the first cities in the world for the fourth millennium, which was threatened by floods and still actually is threatened by floods. But the conservation of urban areas like Fez in Morocco, which became a very important highlight of the interventions of UNESCO in this field. Lalibela in Ethiopia, very one of the most extraordinary, archaeological and architectural, constructions in the entire continent of Africa. These churches, as Maya knows very well, are actually cut. They're rock-hewn churches. They're not built. They're cut in the rock. It's kind of extraordinary thing. And some, of course, this very, very famous area of for the slave route. This was the island where the slaves were brought in to be then shipped to the Americas. Or the city of Kathmandu, which was highly threatened by modern constructions and so on. The island of Easter Island, the Rapa Nui in Chile, or the protection of the famous Moai, Machu Picchu in Peru. I'm just going through examples of the Galapagos Island, of course, where Darwin made his discovery on evolution and so on. And of course, my own, which is Venice, as you I'm Venetian, which, as you know, is threatened by floodings and that really threatened the city. But thanks to a campaign that started in 1966 and took many years, almost 50 years, at the end, Venice is now protected by this system of gates. I mean, these I'm showing just examples of, because this thing became a global affair, something very, very important. I think this transition from, the heritage from essentially a focus of interest of a small elite to a global affair is something that needs to be studied and understood, because many of the things that we do today are linked to this past. And one thing that certainly will appear is that, in fact, heritage is not just, because of this long history, it's not just one thing. This is something that it's also difficult to understand, because we think that heritage, we see heritage as one element, but in fact it is more a layers of meanings, or so they have somehow accumulated along the centuries. Now, the first one to understand this important dimension of heritage was this thinker. He's an Austrian art historian. He was actually more an expert of Oriental art, and he wrote a lot about Oriental tapestry and so on. But he realized this very, very important thing, that heritage is essentially a bundle, a layer of meanings. It's not just one thing. And he wrote this very important book, which I recommend you to read, because it was written in 1903. So it seems something very far in the past, but it's actually one of the most modern and lucid interpretation of the meaning of heritage, the modern cult of monuments. Something that you can immediately visualize, because today the heritage is becoming like a religion, with people, with enormous masses of people visiting sites and so on, as if they were religious processions. But the most important thing here is the fact that he analyzes heritage in its composite form. So he somehow unpacks the heritage and defines a system of values that represent, explain why heritage attracts many people from different origin, different social origin, different social, say, and educational levels, and so on. And I think it's a very important moment in which finally heritage has been understood for what it is for modern society. And of course, this value approach is something that has been elaborated and also it's evolved in its own, and it is today certainly a very important pillar of the way in which we understand and interpret heritage. But it all was born here. Then, of course, we had the institutionalization of all the processes of heritage. And you certainly know the Venice Charter, because it's the bread and butter of everybody who deals with heritage. This was in 1964, so it's much later. It's almost like a half a century more, 60 years after Riegel, the first time in which the principles of heritage conservation, its role in society, was somehow written in a charter. Charters are normally done by ICOMOS, which is the International Council of Monuments and Sites. And all throughout its history, ICOMOS has done very many. So it's not just the Venice Charter. Venice Charter is considered like the founding stone, but now we have today many. I'm just listing here a few, but there are almost 20 charters of all sorts. Because, in fact, the Venice Charter, the one I just showed, it's a very simple document, somewhat like one page, essentially, a little more, that focuses on the issue of restoration of monuments. So because it was mostly written by architects, so in a way, it looks at heritage as from its monumental shape. It's essentially a charter for monuments. But but heritage, in the past 50 years, has taken many forms. We have heritage of all sorts. We have archaeology, of course, and then we have our architecture, but then we have itineraries, we have landscapes, we have industrial heritage. So if you actually list the different forms that heritage has taken, you will be shocked, because it's very difficult to comprise all these different the different nature of all these heritage aspects within one single charter. And certainly, the Venice Charter cannot cope with all this complexity. So in fact, ICOMOS has developed throughout the past 50 years 60 years or whatever, many other documents which form a body of, they call it doctrinal documents. I don't like the word doctrine, but that's what they use, which cover all sort of elements and all sort of types. So again, we have another transition, from essentially a monumental approach, monumental understanding of heritage. Heritage was linked to the concept of monuments, to something else, something that is so broad today that sometimes we somehow have problems in understanding all this complexity, because they are very diverse. When you talk about landscapes and you compare it to cities, to historic cities, or to archaeology, you understand that the heritage covers a very broad, very extensive field of not only of objects, but especially of skills. You need a lot of competency, different competency to deal with this thing, because those who know about cultural tourism don't know much about archaeology or maybe underwater heritage or so on. So you need, it's become a very, very large field, very large, very complex, very articulated, and somehow diverse, not only for the object, but also regionally diverse. In fact, one thing that has happened also is that many other regions of the world have somehow, I wouldn't say criticized, but in a way consider that most of the text that ICOMOS has done, starting with the Charter of Venice, were very marked by the European origin of heritage. They are linked to this monumental approach. They are linked to certain ways of conserving and restoring heritage and so on. So in the past 50 years, there's been many attempts to sort of regionalize also, the way in which heritage is understood and protected. And it's a few examples here that you have, like the Chinese have done, a set of principles for the conservation of heritage in China. The Indonesians have done it, the Africans, and then Indians, and so on. And so you have a lot of. This is just a few examples. If the full list is very big, because you have many regions that want to somehow link the process of heritage conservation to their own traditions, which is in a way necessary. So the other change that has happened very clearly is that heritage has become global. It was born certainly was born in Europe, and therefore it carries these values. And I think it's, I don't say that negatively. I say that positively, because the fact that it is a European somehow product, also almost like a gift to the rest of the world. In a way, now today you have the World Heritage Convention, which somehow extends the concept of heritage to many parts of the world. And although the World Heritage Convention itself is criticized for being too much, Western and so on, but in reality, this has been a major, innovation and a major, I would say, transformative idea in the past 50 years. So it's a very good gift to the rest of the world. Of course, it's a gift that comes with certain conditions. That's why it's important the moment in which heritage becomes global, to have somehow local, regional approaches that respect the other pillar of modern cultural policy, which is the diversity of the different, say, historical experiences of the world. There is a charter which I really recommend if you haven't heard about, because it's actually quite advanced from that point of view. It's called the Burra Charter. Burra is a place in Australia, and it was done by Australia ICOMOS as a charter for places of cultural significance. But I think it was so intelligently shaped, intelligently formulated, and in fact, it represents, in my view, a very big advancement in the concept, in how you can address the issue of, what the value of heritage for society, by shifting the meaning, the key, say, interpretative meaning from this concept of authenticity and integrity. They are so clearly of a European brand, no European brand, to the idea of significance. Now, you can understand perhaps very quickly the fact that, well, authenticity is something that has to be somehow interpreted from the top. You need experts to say what's authentic and not authentic. Significance, on the contrary, is a concept that looks at the way in which the value of a certain heritage site for society. So in a way, it's more like bottom up. It looks at how people see their heritage. So in a way, there is also a transition. I think it's a big change that happened in the past decades from a top-down approach in which heritage is essentially identified by experts or by governments, to a bottom-up approach in which heritage somehow listens to the people, to the society, to the significance that this has for certain groups and so on. I think this is something we'll come back to this because it's a very important change of heritage. Now, I have in my book, and I will reuse this partition. I've studied two elements. One is, I call it internal tensions, which in my view are things that are now becoming, becoming problematic inside the system of heritage. And then we will look at external pressures, the form that in which heritage is influenced by external elements. Internal tension, there are very many. I'm going to go very quickly because we don't have much time, but essentially are linked to elements that are constituent to the origin of heritage. Again, as I just said, very often heritage is essentially determined from a system of power. Let's call it power, either intellectual power, political power, and very often this the way in which heritage is identified and somehow dignified as a value for society forgets elements that are so important, or communities that are linked to this heritage, but they are not represented in the power system, both intellectual and political. It's an example I put here. There are many examples, but you will just understand when I explain this one. This is a statue of a goddess. Now, you will notice that this goddess, whose name is very difficult to pronounce, but it's Coyolxauhqui, is a Maya, Aztec actually, goddess. You will notice that this goddess is cut in pieces. You have a head, legs, arms, bodies, and so on. Because the legend goes that she wanted to kill the king of the god when he was still in the womb of his mother. And but the king of the god was more powerful, so he killed this goddess and cut it into pieces. So in this historical representation of the Aztec, the goddess is represented like this. Now, this stone, it's a very big stone, like 3 meters diameter, was found in 1978, so very recently, in Mexico City. When Mexico was conquered by Cortés in the beginning of the 16th century, the entire Aztec city was demolished, and another city, a Spanish capital, was built over it. So the Templo Mayor, which is the biggest temple, was destroyed and buried under the new foundation of the new Spanish city. And that was like this for centuries. But in the beginning of the 20th century, and then later on, especially after World War II, and thanks to some project of building a metro line, they found this stone, and this was somehow representative of a quest of the many parts of the Mexican society to be represented also in their history linked to the Aztec history, because of course in Mexico it was created by the Spanish, but there was something before, and this identity had been completely buried by the Spanish identity. So in a way, it was a way to reinstate the value of a history of a society that had been buried, for centuries under a political dominance of another system, the Spanish in this case. So I think this, just to make it very short, very often, and more often than we think, heritage has multiple values that are not recognized in the official definition and the official narrative. And therefore, there are many communities, societies, communities that don't appear in the heritage narrative, in the heritage description. And unfortunately, we have seen that even in the World Heritage Convention, this happens very often because the proposition of a site for World Heritage inscription is done by a government to an international body. So there's very little space for the voice of local communities. And this is one of the big limitations and big issues that surround the World Heritage Convention today. Of course, it's very important to, more and more, it's recognized the importance of identifying and valuing the history of all the communities that have, lived in the site. And because very often they attach values to this site that are not simply seen, they're not included in the official statements. So that's an internal tension, as you can understand. I have many examples of this. Is the Temple of Angkor, but if you look around and think about, you will find many, many, many cases. I would say that the majority of the sites that are inscribed in the World Heritage List may need a revisitation under this optic, trying to sort of see what have we forgotten in terms of values that belong to a site, but because of this, say, governmental top-down system, they have been forgotten. This is another case, for instance, the famous Uluru Rock, in Australia, which was inscribed. This is a case that was inscribed as a natural site because it's a very unique geological formation. But it turns out that this is one of the most important site of the spiritual life of the Aboriginal groups that live around, but these have been forgotten, right, for at the beginning. So, it took many, many years, almost 2 decades before these were recognized. And now this site is inscribed both for its natural values, but also for its cultural values. And I can assure you can do an easier exercise. Many, many sites have this issue of non-recognition, to the point that, you certainly know the work of this scholar, Laura Jane Smith. She's one of the founders of the critical heritage studies in heritage. And she has called it the authorized heritage discourse, which means that there is a official discourse of heritage, which somehow excludes many, many groups and many communities, and of course is based on this, say, let's call it Western approach, and very sort of government-led views of heritage, which very often supports economic interests and so on. So the points that she raised was became very, very important in the discussion of heritage, and this HD, authorized heritage discourse, is a very important breakthrough, in the discussion of the value of heritage. And then other types of internal tension. I personally think that, for instance, that we have a big problem in the World Heritage Convention in general when we deal with heritage, in this split, totally artificial split between the tangible values and the intangible values. I know that there are 2 conventions, one for tangible, one for intangible, and this is something we have to deal with. It will be very difficult to go back but let's be clear. This tangible intangible division, partition, is not good for heritage, because tangible heritage always carries intangible values, and because intangible heritage always carries tangible values. It's I think in reality the distinction is not very, very helpful, in somehow identify the value of a heritage for society, because we are creating an artificial split between these 2 things. And you can imagine many communities, they don't understand it. They don't understand why should something be considered tangible rather than intangible. By the way, even in our own in the European situation. We have a very funny case. Like I brought this up front. This is the Struve geodetic arc, which goes from Norway to Ukraine. It was the first scientifically measured arc of the Earth meridian, which was very, very important to, and it was done by Struve, who was a German astronomer, who was needed to do it because at that time they didn't know whether the Earth was flat or elongated. No, it sounds strange for us because we know that. But Newton has said that the land it was flat at the top because of the acceleration of the higher velocity in the equator. But there were other people that thought it was like pier-like. So he had to measure this. It took 40 years to do this measurement with the triangulation, the trigonometry, and so on. And many of the points had to be built. So 2 points for reference for this triangulation. So my question is the measurement of a meridian a tangible or intangible thing, heritage? And as you can understand, it's very difficult to answer to this question according to the classical principle. So there are dichotomies inside our vision of heritage that are not useful, not good. And the other one is, of course, culture, nature, because this again, it's very artificial. These are two volcanoes, Mount Etna and Mount Fuji, one in Italy, one in Japan. And they are exactly the same type of volcano. They call them stratovolcano because they're formed by a successive stratification as the lava comes out. They're more or less the same height. They're more or less, they're very similar thing, very similar natural formations. But Mount Etna was described as a natural heritage and Mount Fuji as a cultural heritage. So again, in the same year, by the way. So it's very strange how the way in which we sort of move around this. It shows the contradiction. So there are internal contradictions. I think it will be important to address them, and there have been some efforts, by ICOMOS, IUCN, and even the World Heritage Center has done some effort into this because at some point we will have to deal, with this issue of this separation between culture and nature that is so strong, in the heritage field and in the World Heritage Convention. You know very well that we have two types of heritage, culture and nature, but we have a set of criteria, but some belong only to culture, some belong only to nature. So there is a problem there that has to be at some point addressed. The other internal tension has to do with this type of heritage, which is called in many forms, many ways, dissonant, negative, bad heritage. And of course, it's something that was not foreseen at the beginning. When the World Heritage Convention was created, it was created to somehow protect the most beautiful place on earth, the most enjoyable, and so on. It was for the beauty, but then it turns out that there are many sites that have enormous value in terms of say memory and collective memory, and they have to be somehow also protected and represented. But the convention didn't know how to do it, because they don't have the tools. There's no tools. The reason why I'm saying that is because most of this dissonant heritage carries enormous emotional and political weights, and the convention is not equipped for these kind of things. So when Auschwitz-Birkenau was inscribed in the World Heritage List, the committee accepted it because it was impossible not to put it, but said, okay, it's like an exception. We will never do any other thing like that, because of course, this didn't happen like this. And then we had many others. We had Robben Island, which is the prison of Mandela. Then we have Island of Gorée, which you already saw. Hiroshima with the atomic bomb. The memorial of Nanjing is not in the World Heritage List, but it's certainly decent on heritage. So now we have more and more and more and more. And in the past few years, there's been a huge discussion inside the system of heritage and World Heritage, because many countries have proposed new negative or dissonant heritage types. For instance, the genocide of Rwanda, or I don't know, the cemeteries of the World War I. I mean, so you look at that, and it seems like this is becoming almost a new. There's a new pressure for this kind of recognition, and this is dangerous, in a way, because very often these carry political and emotional values that are difficult to manage. But anyway, for the time being, these have been accepted, so there are quite many now in the World Heritage Convention, and more are coming because they've been proposed. But there is also a caution that we have to improve the system, the internal system, if we want to avoid too many tensions that are linked to this kind of. There are a lot of people that have studied this, and of course there are a lot of, especially I like the work of Greg Ashworth and William Logan. William Logan is an urban, both actually Logan is an urban planner and Ashworth a geographer, and they were also looking at how this heritage can be integrated in the planning of urban planning or regional planning, because they become part of the life of people. Just putting this as a reference for you if you want to explore more of this issue. In some cases, I think this dissonance is so big that you have to do something. And I like the work that was done by Cheryl McDonald, because she looked at these enormous buildings that have been built by the Nazi in Nuremberg. Nuremberg, you remember, it was a place where all the défilé, all the parades of the Nazi were taken, were done. And now Nuremberg finds itself with this enormous structures that you can't demolish, but at the same time you can't even preserve because they are representative of a very negative past. So the Germans actually found an interesting way of dealing with these things. Maybe it's something that needs to be studied, and for future purposes. Somehow they decided to do an interesting process of trivialization of. Trivialization, I don't know how you can translate it, but it means that you actually lower the value of a place, and by letting essentially the structure to decay, as you can see on the right bottom, and using them for banal things like deposit, or just things that are not linked to. It's not a celebration of as as it was conceived originally. But now this is something interesting and something to look at. When a site of a dissonant site becomes also a place of say protection and of human rights, it becomes called sites of conscience. And there is an very interesting association called the International Coalition of Sites of Conscience that promote this kind of things, that they protect heritage with the purpose of exposing to modern society the issues of heritage, of human rights protection and so on. This is the case, for instance, of the ESMA, which is one of the casernes, one of the places where they, in Argentina, where they tortured the desaparecidos and they killed a lot of people and so on. By the way, this has also been described in the World Heritage List recently, and many others are like this. But this, I think it's a very interesting way of dealing with these kind of things. Trying to, and then of course you have a toxic heritage, I call it. Of course, one of them is in your country, you know very well, Chernobyl. But there are very many like this, and some of them are, known more for the disaster, but others have been inscribed in the World Heritage List there, so they're now becoming an issue, because if you inscribe a toxic heritage, then you have to deal also with the problem of preservation and the management of. That's the case of the Vallonia mining sites, for instance, where all these little mountains, which are the debris of the digging of the coal, are there. So and they're of course very toxic. But because of the impact on society, these places become also places of memory. It's the case of Chernobyl, for instance, and Bhopal for sure. And so they become heritage. So we have to deal also with this kind of. And again, it's not easy. I'm sure, because I know that World Heritage Convention doesn't have the tools for addressing these kind of things. So there are internal tensions that come from this type of heritage too. Then we have the issue of colonial heritage. It's very, very strange. I looked very, very much in detail on this issue, because until World War II, three quarters of the world were colonial or under colonial rule. I mean, this is so, a heritage that you find around the world very often has colonial origin. And how to deal with that, it's not been really well studied. And for reasons that are very simple to understand, colonialism and post-colonialism carry a lot of political, problems. In fact, I don't think the word colonialism has ever been used in the World Heritage Convention, because the moment you use it, you bring about a lot of very difficult problems in relation within the relationship of the member states. So as a result, we have a variety of situations. Sometimes, like in the case of, at least in this picture, the Asmara. Asmara has been described by the Eritrea as a modernist city, but it is in fact a colonial city of the Italian period. Very beautiful, by the way. Some of these architecture are quite interesting. But so in fact, there was a process of incorporation of the values of the colonial heritage into the new values of the modern and independent Eritrea. But that's not the case very often. This is the case of Cusco, for instance. Now you see very well the layering of pre-Hispanic and post-Hispanic, and sometimes this creates some tensions. What do you preserve, this or that? It's like I showed earlier. Some cities like Saint Louis in Senegal has been now become, it's also a World Heritage, and also Rabat. New Delhi, which is a British city, of course, with the interpretation of local value, but now the contemporary government doesn't like it at all. This city was in the World Heritage list. Now it disappeared because they don't want to value something that they consider colonial. Rabat, on the contrary, made an effort to somehow value the layering process. So they put in the same nomination the Medinas and the modern French city that was built in the 20th century. So you see there is an enormous variety and differences, but this creates a lot of tensions in the system. Sometimes, like in the churches of Chiloé in Chile, you have a complete integration. The Dutch had done a lot of effort to somehow, integrate and create the concept of what they call it, the shared heritage. The shared heritage. Again, this is an area that probably requires a lot of more, say, study and exploration, because it's not been clearly, there are no clear rules on that, but certainly is a big tension, internal tension of the system. The human rights is one of the biggest. I'm afraid that nowadays we have many situations. We had a case there a few years ago of this national park in Thailand, where which was described in the World Heritage list, in spite of the fact that there was evidence of expulsions, which the same thing that Saskia Sassen, the very famous sociologist, has studied for. She looked into the way in which globalization has incrementally expanded the issues of expulsion of people from land. And this is one case, and I think it was very badly managed by the convention, because in a way it was clearly also there was a presence of the representative of the indigenous people. They wanted to have a voice, and they didn't give them the floor, and the discussion, it was very, very serious. Probably one of the worst cases there. And we have today many cases, like for instance, all the parks in Africa, which are very important from a tourist point of view, so economically very important. But this means that the local population, in the case of Tanzania, for instance, now with the Maasai population, there is a lot of conflict between the authorities and these local people that have been living there for millennia, and now they are become a nuisance, for the tourists. In some situation like the one I listed on the bottom, the Primachov Aki, on the contrary, which is in Canada, some solution has been found, and the Canadians have been given a lot of say autonomy to the indigenous people, to the point that this site was described on proposal of these indigenous people, of course, through the government, but they were the ones that benefited. So human rights, very big, and gender, again, something very little represented in in the one heritage list, issues of women's rights and so on. There are very few of these, but I think it's coming back. Now, package of it, as you can see, is very big, and I'm even summarizing of internal tension. But then the pressures from the outside, especially after globalization, have increased tremendously. Certainly, one thing that I put up front is the issue of development. We have very fast development processes that affect many, many sites, natural sites mostly, but also cultural sites, for mining, for oil exploration, for resource extraction, and so on. And they are, attacking and affecting these sites. This is the case of Tanzania, where, this is one of the largest game reserves in the continent, where the government decided to build a big hydroelectric power in the middle. And of course, it's development for them, but, it becomes a distraction for the heritage. So there is an issue of conflict between development and heritage. And in spite of the fact that everybody talks about sustainable development, I think there is a lot of ambiguity in the word sustainability of development, and many, many cases that have are coming to the forefront, especially in regions where you have a lot of resources, or sometimes protected, because they're even protected by by the UNESCO or by parks and so on, and now they become very important for exploration. Then you have the issue of tourism. Well, I'm not going to go very long, although this is probably one of the biggest issues for heritage today, and it's global. This is the case of a Chinese city of Lijiang, very beautiful, fantastic city. But now, an example, you go there, it's an example of gentrification and touristicization, like you find in many situations, like I find in the center of Paris, for instance, in the Marais, or you find in everywhere. And gentrification is not a recent thing. It's something that was studied from the 50s on by Ruth Glasson, a British urban planner. But it is today, a big issue, because it has created a lot of reaction, and we are now in very many countries in a war state. This is Barcelona, for instance, where you see, where there are a lot of and of course, the process is global. I think you find it everywhere. Certainly, Western Europe is very strong, and you find it in all the tourist locations, in which you have this transition. The heritage has been protected by laws, by financing, by public resources, and so on. And for this reason, it becomes very valuable as a place for tourism. So, in effect, it's an interesting, contradiction, because you invest public resources that should benefit the population, but then in fact, it only benefits an industry, tourism. Sir Sharon Zukin is the great expert of this. She studied in New York, and the way in which, through the substitution of industrial production in the lofts in New York, this has created an enormous and unstoppable gentrification process. Amsterdam is trying to do something. The only city that has launched, you see, this program is called City in Balance, which means, okay, let's get the tourists, but we don't want this to destroy the society. So they've done a lot of effort on that. And of course, now even the UNWTO, the United Nations World Tourism Organization, is very worried about, because it is becoming a big problem. So they issued, many code for ethical tourism. Even there is a convention on that. So there are policies that are actively pursued, but it's not an easy thing to keep under control. Sacred heritage, another source of pressures on heritage, because very often heritage has values that are linked to religions. Case of Jerusalem, of course, but there are many others, and this is everywhere. I think we looked at probably something like 25% of the sites inscribed in the cultural sites in the World Heritage List have religious values. So you can't really forget it. And sometimes these religious values become, moments of conflict. This is the case of this Babri Mosque in Ayodhya in India, which was destroyed, literally destroyed, demolished, as you can see, in 1992, and then now rebuilt as a Hindu temple by Modi, which just inaugurated actually there as a new Rama temple, just to show you how heritage the sacred dimension of heritage become a source of an enormous pressure and distraction. This lady that has
Francesco,
studied a
I'm
lot.
so sorry. Forgive me. I feel like complete barbarian here, but just a small reminder, just 5 more minutes so
Yeah.
that we have
Yeah, okay,
enough.
don't worry.
Thank you
I
so
think I'm
much.
almost done. And then conflicts, of course, is another issue. I think you have more to say than me on this, certainly. But no, just make mention that it's not just for cultural heritage, but also natural heritage. Of course, we have in the past years, we had so many, 30 years have been really very, very, but to the point that now many approaches also to heritage have been changed, and we can talk about later on. Of course, you have cases everywhere. Now, threats are there. Some are traditional, like fires, others are linked to climate change, and certainly this is something that will have to be on the forefront when not this kind of external pressure, the climate-related pressures. Now let's close with the politics. I think it's important because I think everything depends on politics, and politics have been in the recent years strangely drifting towards in a direction that I don't think goes it doesn't help in many of these issues. There's been more centralization, more appropriation by member states, by central powers of the policy on heritage, and civil society has not been involved and incorporated in the decision making. Lynn Mescal has written a book which is called Future in Ruins, which is an analysis of all this politicking around the UNESCO thing. But I think you can understand very well, that this is not just a UNESCO world. There's more amp. So I've looked into this issue, and we essentially tried to understand how civil society could play a bigger role. In fact, I think that most of the issues that I've dealt with, both internal and external, cannot find a solution unless there is a greater involvement of civil society in the process, in the decision-making process, in the implementation, in the interpretation of heritage, in the way in which it is lived by the society. So I looked into the thing, and I came up with my own model. I apologize for this, but it's essentially very simple, almost banal way of dealing with this issue, saying, okay, we have many actors in the field. We have central and local governments. We have heritage organizations. We must have civil society as well. And then all these 3 elements, and perhaps more, this is not dogmatic, it's just a suggestion, perhaps more, but can come up into an equal kind of field, in a playing field in which each one can express its own interest and its way, its own values on heritage. And perhaps this would be a way to define a more, say, human-centered policies and make heritage a resource for society that is able to deal with some of these pressures and tensions. Okay, thank you very much, Maya. I hope I've been within the time limit, and I'm really happy to listen to you now and to have an exchange with you. Thank you.
Francesco, this has been absolute delight, and as I already said, a real tour de force. Thank you. This was a phenomenal presentation, and if I could just ask you, if you don't mind putting back the presentation, because
Yeah,
I
sure.
think that the last slide is. Despite you trying to play it down, I think it is really one of the most
Let me see if I can.
innovative.
Let me see if I can find. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Yes.
But before I ask questions, I do need to be fair, and there are quite a few of them in the chat already. I also wanted to ask our colleague Andrei Standera from the Kharkiv School of Architecture if he wanted to say a few words. Andrei, hello, you here? If you wanted to just say a few words on behalf of our co-host and partner. If I can just ask you to keep it brief. Sorry, Andrew, you have a lot of questions.
Thanks a lot, Maya. Thanks a lot for giving me the word. And first of all and foremost, thank you, Francesco, for an amazing lecture. And yes, I had a lot of questions indeed. But I have to tell that you answered most of them already in your lecture. I was trying to prepare myself and maybe to ask you some questions, but yeah, you already answered them in the lecture, and thank you so much for that. I guess it's very important that that people like you are joining the discussion around Ukrainian heritage in this moment. Thanks a lot, Francesco. And my question, maybe very briefly, would be we have a couple of, let's say, very very important topics around heritage in Ukraine in a discourse. First one is around Soviet era heritage, because I have a feeling that that it is not maybe appreciated much, but it is a very difficult question in terms of post-colonialism and how to deal with it. My question would be, how do you see this problem, this process of embracing Soviet era heritage involve in Ukraine? How it could be developed in the future, and what we can do as a teachers and as an architects to maybe to raise the question of it more. And the second question would be around the shared heritage. I'm here from Lviv, and sometimes we hear a lot of opinions about this is the Polish side of the cemetery, this is the Polish heritage, the Jewish heritage, and so on. And I have a feeling that right now it is more of a contested heritage than a shared one. So how do you see this contested heritage to become a shared one in this kind of situations? Thanks a lot, Francesco.
Wow, big questions. Do you want to have more questions, or we go for each one?
Maybe if you could answer now, and
yeah. But look, of course, they're both very, very, very big and important, you know. And now, in the case of the first one, I think that heritage should be seen as an expression of values from the society, from the bottom. In some cases, Soviet heritage was not considered part of the modern societies. You know, you have a lot of situation in Poland, for instance, you know, where in fact the entire Soviet memory has been completely eliminated. But you have also the other one. And what I'm working on is actually quite interesting, because it has to do with Soviet heritage of Uzbekistan. It's something you could look at, because Uzbekistan, of course, has the same idea as colonial heritage, and where it's not Uzbek and so on. So, but after 30 years of their own independence, you know, they start looking at this heritage, which, by the way, as an architect, I said, extraordinary heritage, you know, because, as you know, Tashkent was destroyed by a quake in 1963, and the Soviet republics all participated to the reconstruction of Tashkent with their best architects and so on. So they invented a new style, which is a modernist style, but with a oriental touch, so kind of orientalist architecture. So the result is very, very interesting, to the point that the government has decided to propose this Soviet heritage for World Heritage listing. And it will be the first one, the first Soviet heritage in the World Heritage list, even before even before the Russians. And so, you know, again, you have enormous. I mean, Kharkiv was built, you know, during the Soviet times as a city, and you have there, you know, some amazing architecture. You know, before the current war, we were discussing with our friend, unfortunately passed away, Jean-Louis Cohen. You may know him. You know, in fact, the heritage of Kharkiv, it's so important from the point of view of architecture that it should be considered for also for international value. But today, you know, these things can only be addressed in the current, say, situation. So because it's, you know, we have a different culture today of, you know, after what is happening and so. So I think it's perhaps you know, it's time to sort of, you know, somehow reflect and listen to the people and see what they want, and perhaps there will be a time in which this approach will change. I think it will be interesting for you to look at the nomination of the Soviet heritage of Tashkent. It will be an interesting experience. For the other one, shared heritage, very complicated, because shared, unfortunately, is a very ambiguous term, because it means that you somehow compart. You're part of the same thing. You share like you share a cake or something like this. But it also means that you are, somehow secluded. Sharing means also that you separate. So the term itself is is ambiguous. There are important cases. I show some of them which this shared heritage worked as a concept. For some of them in Asia, also in Indonesia, have been very interesting ones. But it's not easy because again, it has to do with the memories, it has to do with how people feel about that. And of course, some communities are very jealous about this thing and they don't want to to separate. So I think case by case it has to be looked. And of course, it's important to learn from the others and to learn from experience, but you can't impose it from the top. That's very difficult. Sorry, maybe it's just partial answers, but the issues are very complicated. We should do a special seminar on that.
Francesco, we might take you up on this if you allow. Thank you. Thank you so very much. We have a lot of questions in the chat, so I'm going to go through them. But if anyone would like to ask a question orally, you can also raise your hand and
yes. And Maya, if you want, I can stay longer. There's no problem for me. It depends on you.
That's wonderful. We definitely would like to take you up on this. So thank you. So that takes some pressure off. Please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question or add your question to the chat. In the meantime, I'm going to read the first question. It's from Marvin, and the question is, does the local community can stop heritage valuation of their place, particularly in the areas of conflict in which the heritage or memory might be too painful and they are not ready yet I understand, for this to be heritage?
Yeah, I think see the problem is that very often, of course, we didn't go much in detail. Very often in conflicts, you have a situation in which a new form of heritage is born, which is the heritage, the memory of people. Let me talk briefly about a subject that I'm dealing with at the moment. It's Gaza. Gaza, it's catastrophic. You can see that there's complete annihilation of an entire thing. All the heritage places, what we used to call the heritage places, have been destroyed. Mosques, museums, everything. There are a few left, but they are essentially the ruins of. So we have a group of people that are discussing how to help Gaza reconstructing their own heritage field. And in fact, we are a bit helpless. I mean, because are we going to propose to rebuild, historical churches? I mean, this makes no sense because the situation there is so extreme that in fact the only thing that might make sense is to create space of memory for people, to allow people somehow to represent their pain and probably you have similar situations there, of course, in Ukraine with the conflict. But again, especially in this case, you can't impose a concept of heritage. You have to wait and work with the people and somehow let the people decide what is heritage. And sometimes it might be new forms that we normally don't call heritage, but we are wrong, not the people.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Francesco. This is a very, very important answer. And moving on to the next question from Sanya Siraj, a dear colleague from Pakistan. Sanya is asking, speaking from a local perspective, custodians of cultural heritage in economically challenged countries feel a threat of losing heritage to the globalization of cultural heritage. How do we address this issue? A small question.
Another small question. Look, the issue is very important because, in fact, the explosion of modern tourism, mass tourism. I mean, if there is a process that we have to consider exemplifying globalization, is tourism. Millions of people moving around, and of course affecting, bringing resources. I know many communities in the developing countries that live out of this. So you can't say, it's wrong, because they live, they make their living out of it. The problem is that very often tourism, has the power to reshape heritage, because heritage has to be reformatted for the new users, for the new consumers, and this entails a loss of values, because if you have a heritage that is traditionally linked to a community, and then it becomes a tourist object, you can imagine this. For instance, one of the cases I showed was Borobudur, the temple of Borobudur, one of the stars of tourism in Indonesia. It's a Buddhist temple in an Islamic country, but by the way, a Buddhist temple of the 9th century, so it's very, very important. And of course, there are still Buddhists in Indonesia, but they cannot access the temple to do their their function, because the temple is a tourist attraction. Right? So I have many, many, many like this. So I think it's important to be very, very, very clear on what is the value of heritage for society, and prevent certain changing of heritage into tourist or purely economic objects.
It is a wonderful answer. Thank you again. And I have another tiny little question for you from Marvin, which is, can heritage be apolitical?
Well, I have a very simple question. No, it cannot be, because heritage is a social construct by definition. It has always been. And in fact, in my old thing, I'm saying that it should be more a social construct with a more, say, the larger base. So if it is a social construct, by definition, is political, and in the good sense of politics, because let's not forget that there are different types of politics. There's a good politics that want to use heritage for good purposes, education, identity, whatever. And then there are bad politics that want to use the heritage for sectarian purposes or just for exploitation. So now I'm going to say political, yes, but there are good and bad politics.
That's a Solomonic answer. Thank you. There is actually a little bit of discussion in the chat about the degree to which cultural and natural heritage can be political. And actually, the answer seems to be in the chat that it's easier for the natural heritage to be apolitical, but it probably is still political. So do you think that even natural heritage reflects politics?
Absolutely, because the natural heritage has become also an important, I think I showed the case, an important source of economic profits. I mean, so the parks in Africa are the most important, is the cash of the country. So they become political in that sense, because they become objects of exploitation from a tourist point of view. So and also sometimes even in conflict, natural heritage seems like out of conflict. No, it's not like this, because very often even natural heritage is taken in the conflict, so it is a victim of politics. This is I show the case of Virunga, but which is, by the way, even today a source of concern, because it's occupied by militias. So, but there are many situations like that, not necessarily that extreme, but a situation in which conflict affects the value and the conservation of natural heritage.
It's politics. Everything is politics.
Everything is political, but that's not bad per se. It depends on how politics is managed. And my point is that we shouldn't see politics just as something that comes from the top. It has to come from the bottom, and the two should meet at some point. Because we also need governments and you need experts. You can just get rid of them, because they are very important. If you don't have them, heritage will not be preserved. Governments provide resources, provide laws, provide management, and experts are necessary. Otherwise, you don't know what to do, and so on. But so this thing has to meet at some point, and that's the point of this scheme. We have to find a balance that somehow also includes the values of the local civil society.
And actually, so this is a wonderful, sentence to finish on the last question, because there's a bit of a segue to the next one from Marvin also. And Marvin is asking if the governments can be faulted or held responsible if they intentionally do not conserve heritage of value because it doesn't reflect a story or the values that they want people to believe in. So is there a mechanism?
I think so. Of course, this is a point of view of somebody who believes that government do not exist per se; they exist for the society. But this is many governments think they exist per se, and they think the society is at the service of government. So, but I think that we should see governments as infrastructure on the service of society. At that point, they should, in fact, yes, they should be considered responsible if they don't perform what society's interest is, in terms of preservation. And what we're trying to say, and that there should be a much better and bigger listening function from the government towards the society. Listen what the society considers a heritage value. And sometimes this goes outside of the charters, goes outside of the practice. Heritage changes and evolves. Maybe in the future we will have different types of heritage. Let me say one element that we are also researching with a group of friends. We are looking at how heritage, what is the role the heritage is playing in large metropolitan areas. Now, heritage it's always small, really. A monument, a city, something small within a bigger context. But in a metropolis of 20 million people, what is heritage? This is a question that we have, try to address through a NGO, which is called HERITOPOLIS. If somebody wants to look at the website, HERITOPOLIS looks at this. Look, what is the role of heritage in a large metropolitan context, which is not just a big city, it's much bigger. Sometimes it's just a region, and how heritage changes because of this new context. So we have to look at this transition, in the future, the world, in this century, the world will become metropolitan. At the end of the century, half of the people of the planet will live in metropolis. So, are we thinking that our monumental concept will still apply? Perhaps, yes, there will be always monuments, but perhaps there will be other types of heritage that still they haven't been invented yet.
That is very intriguing, and we will add the link to this wonderful initiative in the email that we will circulate together with the recording. If I may I'll move to the next question, which is from our wonderful colleague Darena. And Darena, I'm just going to read it in full. Thank you so much for your insightful talk. It was valuable to explore the evolution of approaches to understanding heritage. I'm also curious about how the required skill sets for heritage professionals have evolved. In your view, what new skills and competences are the most important for heritage professionals during modern challenging times, especially for heritage preservation during the war?
You have a passion for small questions. Anyway, no. First of all, I think I've shown the extreme expansion, the variety, the heritage that we have today. So clearly, this requires different skills. I mean, if you're an archaeologist or a landscape expert, it's different, in terms of. But I think there's more than that, and this is obvious. There's more than that. I think there's been a number of elements that, in my view, have been completely under considered. For instance, let me point to one, which I think is very important: the issue of interpretation of heritage. Now, heritage interpretation, it doesn't exist in the World Heritage Convention. Even the word doesn't exist, as if it wasn't not important. Why? Because in the top-down vision, it's of course, the interpretation is done by the experts and is done by the governments, and also it's always considered something for the tourist. Interpretation is the key for re-understanding or understanding the role of communities throughout history in a given heritage spot, a given heritage site. So interpretation is something that has to be brought back to the forefront, in order as really a tool to understand the layering process of heritage values that we have sometimes forgotten. So if we want to bring back civil society and its values to the forefront, we have to give a lot of weight to interpretation. This is just an example.
This is wonderful example, and thank you so much. So there is still quite a few questions, and they continue to be small, I'm afraid. So the next question is from another dear colleague, Jurko from Skeiron. And Jurko is asking, based on your experience as a director of the UNESCO World Heritage Center, do you think that the existing conventions and charters provide sufficient protection to heritage sites, particularly in the condition of war, where both state parties ratify the corresponding conventions? If not, do you think there are ways to improve the existing protection mechanisms?
Look, this is another complex question, but I would say the answer is very simple. No. The existing international conventions for protection of heritage in case of conflict do not perform efficiently, do not ensure protection to heritage. And this has to do a little bit with World Heritage, but World Heritage was not designed for this, doesn't have any tool. But there are other conventions that have this tool, especially the 1954 Hague Convention for the Protection of Heritage in case of armed conflict, which is an important, very important outcome of, I would say, over a century of debate, because this convention was perhaps the first one to be debated. It started in the late 19th century. The principles were already included in the first Geneva Convention for humanitarian protection in case of conflict. So it's something that has been always there. And then it was only approved, only formalized in 1954. So after World War II, it took two major conflicts to finally bring the member states to the table and sign this thing. And still, it's signed by only 2/3 of the world community. There are still 60 or 70 states that have not signed it. More than half have not signed the second protocol, which is very important because it gives a lot of space to enhance protection and so on. So this thing is trembling. It's not good. I mean, it's only good for to show that we're doing something, and perhaps for training the military. There are a lot of training exercises. Okay, fine. This is under this convention. There are a number of activities which are useful, but when it comes to a conflict and to protect heritage in conflict, it's not efficient. Let me give you a case, which I lived there personally. Aleppo, okay? Aleppo was destroyed completely, the historic part. The countries involved in the war were Syria, Turkey, France, Russia. So all these countries have signed all the conventions. They've signed the World Heritage Convention, they signed the 1954 Convention, they signed the 1970 Convention. So all the countries had signed all the things, and the city was demolished. So I think it's obvious that it doesn't work. Okay, so it doesn't work. What to do? It's complicated. But one thing for sure that we could do as international community is to give more resources and strength to those actors that go into a conflict when everybody goes away. And these conflicts and these actors are two: the military and the humanitarians. Okay, the military should know more about, should have more resources for to consider these elements for protection, but mostly the humanitarian. The Red Cross has in its mandate the protection of society and its cultural goods, but it doesn't have the skills or the resources. When you have a conflict, the priority goes to saving life, not to saving monuments. So you need to have more investment. When this was done, some results were achieved, and this is the only direction, the only possible direction, because the constitutional aspect, the conventions have proven totally ineffective. So at least you can try the action on the ground.
Thank you so much, Francesco. This is this is very important point. Before I ask the next question, I'm just going to, because I note that there are several people here in the audience, like Professor Oresta Remeshilo-Rybczyńska and Vasyl Petrik, several others who are Zoriana Hren, who are among leading voices of heritage protection in Ukraine. And I would like to encourage you to ask questions, seeing that Francesco was generous to agree to stay with us for a few more minutes. But in the meantime, I'm going to read another question from Oleksiy in the chat. So the question, Oleksiy, thanks for the very inspiring talk, and I think that this is important to say again. And the question is: do you think recent architecture without official historical status can still be seen as heritage, as a record of architectural decisions or social context, even if it lacks classical values? And this is the explanation for the question is: in Ukraine, many panel buildings are now damaged by war. Some residents oppose total demolition as these places carry deep emotional and collective memories. How can we approach such non-classical yet meaningful architecture in restoration practice? Another small question.
Look, I think it's a very important question because, in many cases you have situation in which, a place acquires value not because of its artistic or architectural, value, but because of the way in which society attaches memory. And then we spoke about dissonant heritage. I mean, Auschwitz is not very nice, frankly, architecturally. There's no architectural value there, but enormous, memory value. So I think it's important to somehow rebalance things. If a place has memory value for a society, it is heritage for me, even if it's very, very poor in terms of architecture. So I think, again, as you see, we have to look at the bottom up. Because if you only ask the experts, well, they'll say, well, this is not an architecture worth preserving. But maybe for a large group of people, that place is an element of memory, and we call it dissonant because it doesn't match the system of values that have been traditionally associated to heritage, but in fact it is heritage, in the full sense.
And so I'm going to quickly jump in with my own question, although there is a Professor Hannah Shriver in the audience who works on intangible heritage, and she probably is much better qualified to ask this question than myself, or to touch even on this area. Which is, Francesco, you spoke, and this is something very important, and this is one of many reasons why I think your book is so very important, on the false dichotomy between the tangible and intangible heritage. But the question I have is that concretely in the situations of post-war reconstruction, large-scale rehabilitation, what mechanism do you see for inclusion of intangible heritage into conservation decisions?
Well, look, intangible heritage has many forms. We don't have one form. So it depends on what we want. Normally it's traditional expressions or traditional knowledge. This is somehow a definition, more or less definition. And of course, this traditional expression and traditional knowledge need a place, need a space, need to be recognized. So in any form of reconstruction, you have to give form. You have to give a possibility. Physical possibility of these things to be revalued. If you don't have a theater, you can't preserve the theater. So I think these elements of cultural value, significance for society should be given exactly the same value as the physical heritage. If we want to at least in practice go beyond the dichotomy, then of course the dichotomy is deeper than that, because of course the definitions of physical and intangible heritage are so different, so divergent, and that it will be very difficult to bring them together. But at least in practice, when you are, especially in a reconstruction area, you have to give them exactly the same value, because sometimes a traditional expression is as important for a society, for its identity, for a new, for somehow healing the wounds of a conflict, you know, than the physical one. We're experiencing this in Gaza, as I said earlier. No? We're trying to somehow. It's probably even easier because you know, in a way, it's easier to somehow provide a space for traditional expressions than rebuild a heritage that has been completely annihilated.
Francesco, thank you so much. And also, maybe I will just briefly mention that we have colleagues from Gaza and from Aleppo in the audience who both thank you very much.
We're very happy to meet you. Very happy to meet you, really.
And now I'm very happy to see a question from Vasil Petrek, who has been one of the major forces in heritage preservation in Ukraine since the beginning of the war. And Vasil is asking, so Vasil says, war is a threat to any heritage. Modern weapons are erasing monuments from the face of the earth. We see this every day in Ukraine. Is there a need to discuss new principles for reconstruction of completely destroyed heritage sites after the war, or are the current principles sufficient for us? What do you think?
Well, Basil, in fact, this issue was came to the forefront a few years ago because we had so many distractions, and because of the somehow, let's call it, rigidity of the charters, existing charter. People say, listen, it's not gonna work. I mean, you can't apply the Venice Charter to the reconstruction of places like Aleppo or something. So, in fact, and because you're Polish, and this you'll certainly know, there's been an effort by the Polish government to discuss this. And in 2018, I think, this new recommendation, called the Warsaw Recommendation for reconstruction of heritage after conflicts, has been issued. And if you don't know it, I will really encourage you to look at it, because it is in a way, an innovation, very important innovation, one of the rare innovation in the system of accepted principles for reconstruction, in which the value of a place for the healing and recovery of a society is given a lot of weight in the process of reconstruction. It's not just a matter of architects and stone. It's actually really a matter of values and memory for the society. So I think, in fact, from the point of view of, say, principles, and it has been already done, some very interesting advancement have been already done. Yeah.
I'm so sorry. I think I got cut off for a second here.
Yeah.
Technical issues. Thank you so very much, Francesco. So if I can have my question, sneak in one more of my own questions. The question about the diagram that you are showing, because it struck me in your book how very important this is. Now, you present it as very simple. I don't think it is. I think it's wonderful in its simplicity for application, but there is a lot of knowledge behind it. And I wanted to ask you, I mean, of course, Ukraine is in a very, it's the protection of cultural heritage in Ukraine now during war. It poses particular challenges, and the challenges that are particularly acute, and there are particular time pressures. But these relationships, that is rebalancing all this ecosystem that is needed for balance and effective preservation of heritage, and also equitable preservation of heritage, something that you have stressed throughout your lecture. This is something that needs to be nurtured from the start, that needs to be nurtured even now, despite all the emergencies. Would you have any advices on how to do this in this difficult situation of war, how to develop and manage this relationship in a productive way?
Maya, you're asking me something that perhaps I cannot answer, because it's very difficult to give advice to somebody, to people that are really in the middle. I mean, I live in a safe place, and I see conflict as something far away. So I don't think it would be very, very honest from my side to somehow deal with this issue. But I think it's important to look at how you can benefit or profit or use this system of reflection that the international community has done in the past decades and in the past years, especially. And I mentioned the Warsaw Recommendation, but there are many other elements that can, because what we need to insert in the heritage field is a much bigger flexibility. This has been somehow a bit crystallized, through a system of charters and so on. I recognize the importance of this charter because they establish a certain paradigm. But at the same time, we are subject very often to processes of transformation, very quick, that cannot be managed if you look only at these written rules. So let's use some flexibility, intelligent flexibility, and somehow innovate and bring things forward, and with no fear, because again, the values that heritage carries are social values, and so we have to look at society. They're not encyclopedias that have to be brought into our life. They're expressions of people that are around us. And whatever this comes out, so the difficult thing is to find the proper mechanism to consult and to bring together the consensus. This is important, because out of this consensus, you can then validate new forms of heritage or new ways of dealing with heritage. And I would not be very intimidated by the existing, existing paradigms, because otherwise you're not going to go anywhere in a situation like in Ukraine or other places that are subject to stresses and distractions.
Thank you so much for a wonderful answer to perhaps badly worded question. I appreciate that you answered in any case. And if you agree, there is one more question from someone from Ethiopia, also from the region of war, from Tigray, who is asking, how do you evaluate the effectiveness of UNESCO conventions, and especially of Hague Convention, in protecting World Heritage Sites during war period?
I think I answered already, and maybe I don't know if our colleagues from Ethiopia listened to my very sharp and harsh, this description of how ineffective these conventions are, and this is the problem. It's a problem also for the international community, because we can't say, oh, we have a convention that fixes. No, it doesn't fix anything. I mean, so in reality, we have seen more and more and more and more, repeatedly, that these systems and these tools are totally ineffective. So there should be much more, concern at the higher sphere, how to, really protect heritage if they care about. It's not enough to have a convention. This is just a piece of paper, and if it doesn't work, on top it's not signed by a third of the world, so it's not really good. Sometimes you have to say, okay, that's what we have. That's what the present international order can produce. But then we have to look at other forms of other ways. Some of them can come from the professional community, because in fact preventions and preparedness are important things that can be can limit and reduce the impact of conflicts on heritage. And there are many positive cases. There have been very good demonstration of this. But in reality, we are in a void there. Sorry to say. I even wrote an article on this for a book on heritage destruction. Say, okay, we can talk about this, but if we don't, operate structural, reforms in the way in which the actors are enabled to come into the field and do something concrete, then this will remain, just words.
I think that this is a wonderful note to finish on. There's a lot of discussion in the chat, so we're going to go through the comments and integrate any remaining questions to the email that we will ask Francesco we'll share with Francesco maybe for answers, and then share answers with everyone. I don't know if Professor Oresta is with us still. I see that you put a comment in an important comment in the chat, and I don't know if you would like to
Yes, hello, dear. Hello, colleagues. Hello, Maya. Hello, dear Francesco. Thank you so much for the meeting, for your very deep view of several directions of heritage. For me, it was very interesting. And as a board of ICOMOS group of Ukraine, I am, of course, we have a lot of tasks before us. And of course, this rebuilding of Ukraine, it's not only to rebuild cities and towns in the center and east part of Ukraine, but of course to keep the heritage. And of course, we have not a lot of financial, but of course we have also to change a little bit the law. And it's very important that maybe we can organize something like UNESCO Board of ICOMOS meeting, and all together we can influence to politicians in Ukraine and to explain a lot of things which is very important for simple people, that heritage is also very important to support and to renovate, although a lot of these monuments are in the western part of Ukraine, and of course they are very important in our historical level, and also to make the interest for tourists after the war to come and to see this heritage. So the proposal is to make something like table conference among representatives of UNESCO organization and board of ICOMOS of Ukraine. Thank you.
Excellent idea. By the way, you have in Ukraine a group of UNESCO and led by a friend of mine who is very, very good, Chiara Dezzi Bardeschi. She's from Italy. I'm sure you know her. And yeah, propose to her. She's there for this. She's the antenna of UNESCO in Ukraine, and I think it would be very important to start thinking about a conference, like an international conference on these issues, because first of all, it takes some time to organize this conference. You don't do it in a short time. It takes like 6 months, and then you can probably find also support from European Union or whatever, UNESCO itself, in supporting for this conference. But this conference is fundamental because you are now, you have meeting very, very difficult challenges, in terms of reconstruction, and I probably don't even know the complexity, but I can imagine after years of war and destruction what kind of situation you have. So it's important to have the full support of the international expertise and the international community, and to also show the particularity of your cases. So people don't come with a recipe, but they come with support for you to find the solutions.
Yes, because we have a center of UNESCO in Lviv, but there is no representatives of UNESCO. There is something like a club where everybody can have a meeting and to discuss special problems of heritage, even in our center part of the city, which we have every day. So it means that we need more specialists.
Yes. I think if you propose something like this, and I'm sure the foundation can help you, and this people will answer to this, because it's something that has not been done yet, and it's time. It's time to have a big gathering of expertise, sort of somehow to bring the support to you. I mean, that's the purpose, not to bring you solutions, to bring support. Solution you find.
Okay, we'll find, and we will work some ideas of cooperation, and maybe we'll have a meeting in our UNESCO center in our city. Thank you. Great, Francesco. Bye.
Thank you so much. And Francesco, thank you for being so generous. I think this is now bordering on an indecent imposition on your time.
No, but look, it's very interesting for me because I want to understand better the situation there. It's so important.
Well, I think that we also need to, but I would propose that we going to. There are lots of the chat is very active. There are many expressions of gratitude and quite a few lively discussions. So we're going to filter through them. But for now, perhaps I'm just going to thank you so much, Francesco, for this absolutely phenomenal, masterful presentation that clearly gave us appetite
You make
for
me feel,
more.
make me feel. I don't think I did so. I mean, this is part of common culture. I think it's important to somehow say summarize it. But again, I think it's solutions are there, and not really expert.
I think
Anyway,
that you presented a wonderful depth of thought with a real sprezzatura. So it was really wonderful. It was wonderful, and if you allow us, we will definitely take you up on your kind offer of having more lectures and discussions. And I hope that you will that we will be able to welcome you one day in Poland, and hopefully, on behalf of my wonderful colleagues in Ukraine, I know that they would like to welcome you in Ukraine one day, and hopefully this might happen before too long. And for now, I would like to just thank you again for this wonderful lecture, for your generosity with your time. I would like to thank all the participants for a wonderful discussion and for making this really excellent event on Friday evening, nonetheless. And last but very much not least, I would like to thank my phenomenal colleagues, the translator, our translator Olena. I don't know
yes,
if you can show
thank you,
yourself,
Lena.
who is the best translator I have ever met, and the most patient one too, with long discussions. But also my colleagues Athena and Vera. I don't know if you can show yourself briefly, who have made sure that this event runs smoothly, and who are absolute angels of patience. So thank you all so very much, and I wish you a wonderful weekend.
Thank
And
you.
I'm looking forward to seeing you again. We have also added a link to Francesco's book in the chat, and we will send it along with the article which you referred to, Francesco, which I believe is on open access in the Getty publication. So maybe we can share it as well. Thank you so very much, and please be safe, and we see you all very soon.
Thank you, Maya, and thanks to all of you for listening and for interacting with me. It was very interesting, and I really hope that we can have more and more deeper interaction in the future.